The Society in Leeds welcomes you all, and welcome Dr. James Hayton to give a talk on how to get through the PhD, hopefully without any stress. So let's welcome Dr. James.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to come and speak. I know it's the end of the day, and I'm sure you've got better things to do, so I'm going to try my very best to make sure that it's worth your time. And just before I get started, I just want to gauge quickly who we have here. So how many first-year students do we have? Okay. Second year? Third year? Anybody in the very final stages writing up? Any PhD supervisors? No. Okay. Okay, and how many people from the sort of social sciences, humanities, arts side of things? And science, engineering, mathematics? Okay. So we've got quite a mix of people at all different stages from all kinds of different subjects. And of course, because a PhD is quite a complicated thing, it's going to be impossible for me to cover absolutely everything. So really, I see my talk as just an introduction to the question and answer session. So I'm going to outline some basic principles which I think apply to any PhD and can be used at different stages. And then you get to decide what we talk about in more detail, and I'll try to link those basic principles back in to the question and answer session. Just quickly have to get this out of the way, but if you like what I say, then you can buy copies of the book. So you can get it cheaper from me than you can from Amazon. And because it's Christmas coming up, if you want to give a gift to a PhD student who can't be here, then you can get 2 copies for a slight reduction as well. So anyway, let's get that out of the way. So I want to be clear that I'm not talking about removing all of the stress in a PhD. What we want to avoid is the kind of situation where you're so stressed that you can't function properly. So I started my PhD way back in 2003, and at the time I was really just happy to be given the opportunity to be accepted onto a PhD program, partly because I hadn't done all that well at undergraduate level. So I came out with a 2.2, it was a very average grade, and I didn't really feel like I'd done as well as I could have done. So it's part validation, the fact that I've been chosen to do a PhD was a really good feeling. And also I felt that it was an opportunity to counteract that bad grade that I'd got as an undergraduate. So I felt that if I had a PhD on my CV, then nobody would really care about the fact that I had a 2.2 and kind of overrule it. But unfortunately, it wasn't long before I discovered that it's much easier to get onto a PhD program than it is to complete one. And I ended up so stressed that I was at the point of quitting my PhD, but not only that, it was starting to affect other areas of my life as well. So that's the kind of situation we want to avoid. But when I spoke to people at the time and said, I'm really struggling, everybody told me, it's okay, that's just part of the process that everybody goes through. Everybody feels stressed, just keep going, don't give up, and it will be okay in the end. Now these people were trying to be reassuring. They were trying to say, it's okay, it'll be okay. Everybody goes through this. But for me, it felt like they were just dismissing the problem. They weren't taking it seriously. And deep down, I knew that just carrying on and doing the same things, or maybe doing the same things but harder, wasn't going to be an effective solution to the situation I was in. So that's the assumption that I want to challenge, that overwhelming stress is this inevitable or necessary part of the PhD process. And I'd rather start with the assumption that maybe stress is a signal that something is going wrong, or overwhelming stress is a signal that something is going wrong, and that you should perhaps look at doing things differently. So, as I said, it's not about removing all of the stress or all of the difficulty. There are some circumstances where a little bit of stress can be helpful. It can help you to focus, it can help you to push yourself to a higher level. But it's a question of intensity and duration. So, If you face a difficult problem, which is going to happen many times throughout your research, and you experience a little bit of stress, but then you solve the problem, and you come back to normal, and you have these sort of fluctuations throughout the course of your PhD. Obviously, this is really idealized. It's never going to be like this, but basically, as long as you come back to a happy, calm, effective state, then that's all right. But what we want to avoid is this situation where it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds to the point where you're kind of frantic and ineffective and you can't work to the best of your ability. Okay. So, two things I want to look at. First of all, how do you approach the work from the start to avoid avoidable problems later on? And this goes to the kind of basic assumptions you make about what a PhD is, what's required, and how to approach research in general. And secondly, if you're already in this stressed, overwhelmed, frantic state, is there anything that you can do to get out of that situation and bring it back down to this level where you're calm and effective and you can solve the problems that are arising? So we'll deal with the first one first. So basic assumptions. And the most basic thing we can really ask is, what is a PhD fundamentally? What is it that we're trying to achieve? So does anyone want to volunteer an answer? Hopefully, preferably someone who hasn't read my book, because it really ruins my flow if someone gives my answer before I do. So does anyone want to volunteer? Yeah.
Just research, spending some time to do some research and adding a knowledge to the community.
Okay. Anybody else? Lots of reading. Yeah, that's certainly part of it. Any other answers?
A degree.
Sorry?
A degree. A
degree? Yes, it certainly is that as well. Okay, so whenever I give this talk, I always ask this question, and there are some variations in the answers that I get, but there are two really, really common things that come up. One is a PhD is a contribution to the body of knowledge, which is kind of what you were touching upon. And then there are also partial descriptions of parts of the process, so like lots of reading, for example. But these things, they don't uniquely define what a PhD is. So there are lots of ways to contribute to the knowledge. There are lots of different ways to do research. You can do journalistic research, which is sometimes extremely difficult, extremely rigorous, but it's not a PhD. There's something that distinguishes it there. Also, if you already have a PhD and you make another contribution to the knowledge, you don't get another one. So there's something different. So just saying it's a contribution to the knowledge is not quite sufficient. The other type of answer I get is kind of metaphorical. Some people say a PhD is like a journey, or it's like an apprenticeship, or it's a mountain to climb, or these kind of things. And metaphors tend to fall apart when you try to extrapolate from them, or when you look at them too hard. They're good for describing abstract feelings, but not really much more. So what we want is a description of a PhD which is unique, that defines exactly what it is, and that we can also extrapolate useful insights from as well. So the other answer, that PhD is a degree. Of course that's true, but it's only part of the answer. So if we just think of it as being a natural next step from the degrees that you've done before, or the qualifications that you've done before. So you go through the education system. Every time you graduate from one level to the next, some people leave, some people move up, and then gradually it gets more and more difficult till you're left with the people who do PhDs at the very top. There's a problem, though, with thinking of a PhD in this way, and that is that throughout the lower levels of the system, there's a certain consistency in the way the system works. So generally speaking, right the way from school all the way up to undergraduate degree, you have a standardized syllabus, so everybody does the same thing. You have a set timetable, so you know where to be at what time, and then you're delivered the information. You have periodic exams where you build up a cumulative grade. So if you screw up one exam, if you do well in all the rest, it doesn't really matter that much. But as part of that, mistakes are also penalized at the undergraduate level. So if you get something wrong, in an undergraduate exam, your mark is lowered. But then when we look at a PhD, in pretty much every respect, it's not only different, it's almost the exact opposite. So you don't have a standardized syllabus, you have an individual project which you may have to decide on yourself, and nobody's going to tell you exactly what the requirements are in order to be successful. You don't have a set timetable, it's pretty much unstructured. You don't have multiple exams with a cumulative grade. It varies a little bit from place to place, but generally speaking, you have one big thesis and one defense. There's a huge amount of pressure on that one thing. And as I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute, you find that mistakes, rather than being bad, they're actually a necessary part of the research process. This final point, which people often don't think about so much, is at undergraduate level, your competition is local. So in order to do well, you just have to do well compared to all the other people in your class. But at PhD level, the competition becomes global. If you think about making a contribution to the knowledge, that is the knowledge base that other researchers all around the world are contributing to. So that is the level that you have to operate at. So you need to be aware of what people are doing in all of the research groups all over the world in order to be successful at a PhD. So we need to accept that because of these differences, the skills which got you through all of these levels of the system, the skills which got you entry into the PhD system, are not the same skills which are going to help you succeed. Okay, and so we need to look at it in a different way. So I prefer to think of a PhD as being, instead of the top layer of the education system, it's the bottom layer of the professional academic system. So my definition of what a PhD is it's the entrance qualification to the world of professional academia, and the aim of it is to, as a process, is to develop the skills of a professional academic researcher. So if you think of it this way, it means that you are a beginner, and the question becomes, how do you close this gap? If you start off as a relatively inexperienced researcher, at the start of your PhD, and then at the end you have to be expert or professional level, how do you structure your own work in a way that's conducive to developing the skills which are required? There's a couple of things here also to note. It doesn't stop when you graduate. If you carry on in academia, your skills should continue to improve. So it's not like PhD graduation is the ultimate thing. It really is just the beginning. And also, this isn't a linear progression. There's a curve on it, and it starts to curve off. If anyone's really interested in that, I can talk about it more at the end, but I'm going to move on to the next thing. So, how do you close the gap between beginner and professional? So, when you're deciding how to structure your work and what goals you set for yourself, there are certain key principles which can really, really, really help. Unfortunately, I didn't know these when I started my PhD, and I got it very, very wrong from the very start. So, when I arrived at my PhD, one of the very first things that my supervisor asked me to do was to write a literature review. So, because of this feeling that I wanted to do better than I ever had before, and I wanted to make a good impression, I decided that I was going to write the best literature review that the world had ever seen. And so I started reading and writing, and it's a little bit embarrassing to admit now, but I even formatted the writing in a double column format as if it was a journal article, because I thought maybe if it's good enough I can get it published, and that would be a fantastic start. But as I was reading and writing, I very quickly started to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the task. And in the end, I never actually finished that literature review. And, you know, it didn't destroy my confidence, but it just sowed this little bit of self-doubt, which kind of grew over time. But with hindsight, it's obvious. You know, if you set yourself a target which is far, far, far in excess of your existing ability, then you're always going to be stressed no matter how you work. You're guaranteed to fail. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't be ambitious, but it's just understanding that an ambition which is worth pursuing, that's really challenging, is not going to be immediately achievable, and there are intermediate steps which are required. So, applying the principles of skill development. Principle number 1 is start small, start slow. So what I should have done, instead of trying to write the world's greatest literature review, is just start with a handful of important papers. So maybe 4 or 5. Ideally papers which served as kind of a foundation for work in the field or for my specific research, and then take the time to really understand just those 4 or 5. Now, even doing it on such a small scale, it's still really hard, because academic papers, especially when you're reading the first ones, they're hard. You know, they're not written to teach. They assume that you already have kind of an expert level of knowledge. So there's a lot of stuff that's simply not explained. So if you try to rush through it, it's gonna, you know, you're not going to get any value from it. You're just going to end up going slightly mad. So I think start with 1, and if it takes you a week to understand that 1, then it takes a week. But what you find is that it starts off, the first time you read it, it's really difficult. There's so many things that aren't explained, but then you think, okay, let's just take this one idea. You look that up on Wikipedia, you ask somebody, so okay, yeah, I kind of get that. And then you do that for something else, and gradually it becomes a little bit clearer. So the discomfort that you go through when you take on something difficult that you can't do at first, it's a little bit uncomfortable, you know, because you're not quite sure if you're going to succeed. But then you have this series of aha moments, and then gradually it gets easier, and then you think, okay, yeah, I actually get this. And then you add the next paper, and you go through the cycle again. And what happens is you gradually, incrementally build your knowledge and skill in the area, and then when you read more and more papers, you think, oh yeah, I understand that idea because that came from this paper. You start to see links between different ideas, and you get faster and faster as you go. So starting small, even though it's slow at first, it's absolutely crucial to building a skill. Principle number 2, I've touched on it a little bit, but basically stay with the problem. So when you face some kind of difficulty, you know, give it the time that it deserves rather than putting yourself under pressure to be reading more and more and more. So these 2 principles, they're especially important in literature, but they apply to all kinds of, all aspects of research, and the skill development element needs to be built into lots of different things. To go on to principle number 3, I want to give another example. I work with people from all kinds of different academic backgrounds and a lot of social scientists. And so many of them use interviews as a data gathering methodology. Now, one of the things that often happens is they spend a long time reading and planning and developing a research proposal and ethics and all of these different things, sometimes maybe a year or 2 years or more, just on that preparation phase. And then they go out and they do one big round of data collection, one big round of analysis, and then they submit a thesis. But if you do it this way, it puts a huge amount of pressure on that one round of data collection. And so there's no room for making any kind of mistakes. So, you know, that's always going to make you a little bit tense, a little bit afraid, and it's always going to be stressful. But it's actually worse than that, because if you're doing analysis for the first time on this massive set of data, if you have made a mistake in your methodology, the chances are you won't spot it because you have no experience doing analysis. Okay, so you end up in this situation. You can end up in this situation where you've got 6 months left before you have to submit. You're learning analysis while you're trying to write up your thesis, and you simply don't have the skills to reach the required level, and everything you send to your supervisor comes back dripping in red ink, and it's just a nightmare. This situation is, I think, shamefully common. I've come across it dozens and dozens of times, but it's so easily avoidable by giving yourself the opportunity to make mistakes early, and also starting small as well. So, whatever your methodology is, I use interviews because it's a simple thing that anyone can understand in principle. whatever your methodology is, think of the simplest, smallest iteration of that you can do. So if you're doing interviews, interview one person. And it doesn't even have to be someone from your target sample. You know, it could be another PhD student, and it's just for practice. And even when you do it on such a small scale, it's still difficult, because interviewing it's a skillful thing. You have to get the questions right with no ambiguity. You have to get the recording right. And you find that even if you do it with one person, maybe the battery runs out on your voice recorder. Okay? But if you do it as practice, then it doesn't matter, and you can correct that, and then you think, okay, next time I take a backup device or a spare battery or a power charger, you know, whatever. And then if you go through all of the phases that you will have to do on a larger scale, so you do the transcription, you enter the data into the software. So even though the data will never appear in your thesis, it's just gathering experience and discovering those little practical things. And often the difference between a good researcher and a bad one is not so much, it's not necessarily intelligence or knowledge of the field, it's an awareness of these little practical things which can make the difference between often success and failure. So these three principles, I think, apply to any project, no matter what the methodology is. But even if you apply them from the very start, no matter how well you plan or structure your work, one of the universal things in research is that as you progress, things get more and more complex over time. So whatever it is you do, if you read literature, every paper that you read creates more reading, because each one has, you know, a dozen references in the back, and then each of those has another dozen, so it grows exponentially. Every bit of data you gather creates analytical work. Everything you write or everything you discover raises new questions. And so you find that the more you do, the more work you create. And so it's very easy to end up in a situation where you have a million different things that you're trying to do. You can't do them all at the same time. And so the most obvious symptom is that you start to fall behind on all of the plans that you made. Because usually when we make plans, it's the most optimistic version, because you want to impress your supervisor with the plan that you've made. You don't give yourself enough margin for error. So when you fall behind, okay, so the obvious thing is you're not getting enough done in the time that you're putting in. So the obvious solution is focus on productivity and time management. Let's squeeze more out of the time that we have. Now there are circumstances where time management techniques are really, really useful and important, but there are also circumstances where they're not only ineffective, but sometimes harmful. And there are other approaches which you need to have, and you need to know when to use each one. So, when I was doing my PhD, I often tried to have these fresh starts and be more productive, so I'd make these to-do lists and all these timetables and things, and I never, ever managed to stick to it, and it just ended up making me feel worse. As a kind of illustration of how productivity, a focus on productivity, can lead you a little bit astray. Whatever your project is, this will probably happen to you at some point or several times. So you have some kind of plan, and it goes from A to D, and at some point, somewhere in the middle, something goes wrong. Okay. So the question is, if this is going to happen to everybody several times, how are you going to respond when your plan goes slightly wrong? Now, if you have a focus purely on productivity, if your sole goal is to just keep producing more and more and more, and you hit some kind of problem, and the solution is not immediately obvious, then you have a couple of options. One is to just put it to one side, start working on something else, and come back to it later. So that fulfills that goal of staying at least busy, if not productive. But even if you are productive, when a problem arises in that other thing, how do you then respond? Do you switch to working on something else? I don't think I need to explain where that leads you. I just end up going around in circles. So if you don't switch to working on something else, and you stay with the problem, if your focus is still on productivity, i.e., staying busy, getting back into it as quickly as possible, and you just throw yourself back into the work, then this can also lead to problems, because if you just do the first thing that comes to mind, then you deny yourself the opportunity to think of alternative courses of action. And when you're doing academic work, which is universally difficult, often the problems that arise, the solutions are not immediately obvious. And so, often there will be multiple possible solutions. So if you always rush to take the first option that comes to mind, if you always just rush to, must stay busy, must stay productive, then you'll never think of anything beyond the obvious. You'll never think of anything really, really, really creative. And so, a really important thing that so many people find hard to do is just slow down and take some time and not worry so much about being productive all the time. And just give yourself a little bit of time to think of multiple options. So whatever you think of first, think, okay, that's one option. What if I do something else? And then maybe a couple of other things. And maybe you still go with the first option, but at least you've thought through a couple of other steps. And this is really, really crucial in academia, giving yourself time to think. It's kind of obvious, but so often there's this focus on productivity, which kind of gets in the way. Okay, so those are kind of the basic principles. But what about if you're already in this situation that I talked about before, where you're so overwhelmed by the stress that you can't operate normally? You can't even do the simplest of things, and you're frantic and ineffective. So I ended up in this situation. It built up gradually over time. But in my third year, where I was working really, really, really long days, but nothing seemed to work. I had no publications, and it didn't look like I was going to get any publications anytime soon. Sometimes I would go into the lab, and something would break or something would go wrong, to such an extent that if I hadn't gone into work that day, I would have been in a better position than I had been first thing in the morning, because it would take me 2 days to get back to where I was. So this stress was building and building inside, and it started to affect other areas of my life. It started to affect my general temperament. I was getting quite short-tempered with people. It was affecting relationships and all this kind of thing. And one day I was working in a lab, which was this underground optics lab, so measuring very small levels of light. So there were no windows. All the walls were painted black. And especially during the winter, when you come out of a darkened lab and it's dark, and it's that just added to the depression. But I was working with these incredibly fragile probes, which are made from optical fibers. So anyone who's worked with optical fibers knows that they're bendy, which is quite a useful thing. But what I had to do was remove the plastic coating, which makes them bendy, just to leave the glass core at the center. And then various other processing steps, but basically had this strand of glass, which was the thickness of a single hair. So incredibly fragile, really, really difficult to work with. So I'd make them in batches of 10 or 20, because I would always break some, at least, and then hope that some of them survive for long enough. So it took a few days to make them before I could actually do anything really useful with them. And working in the lab, moving them from one lab bench to another, and I dropped them. And it wasn't the first thing that something like this had happened, but something inside me broke as well. And I swore loudly, and I stormed out of the lab. And I just had to get away from there. And as I was walking, I didn't really know where I was going, but I was just thinking, I can't take this anymore. I can't keep doing this. No matter how hard I work, it always seems to go the same way. It's like just running constantly into a brick wall. So I walked across campus, and I was thinking, I'm probably going to fail anyway, so I might as well just quit. So I sat down on this bench, and I started thinking about it, and thought, well, okay, if I do quit, I have to tell my family, my friends, my supervisor. I thought, well, you know what? They'll probably understand, and if they don't, that's their problem. I've done my part. I thought, well, okay, but I'm going to have to find a job. I don't know what I want to do, but I'll find something, and it can't be as bad as this, you know, whatever it is. So I thought, well, okay, that'll be okay. So I guess I'll quit, but if I'm going to quit, then I want to make sure that I've kind of given it one last shot. So there's still a couple of things that I could have tried in the lab. So I thought, okay, I'll go back to the lab, I'll try these couple of things, and if they don't work, then I'll quit and just walk away. And I can walk away knowing that I've given it a final shot. But really importantly, if this was going to decide whether or not I stayed, I wanted to make sure that I did it absolutely meticulously, you know, so that if it went wrong, I knew it wasn't me, you know. I'd done my part.
Justified reason.
Yeah. So went back to the lab, slowed down, took my time, did things as carefully as I possibly could, didn't rush anything, and the experiment started to work. And I thought, shit, no, I can't quit. So I kept going, but what this taught me was the habitual responses that I built up when things were going wrong were really not helping me. So I introduced a number of changes. First of all, whenever something went wrong in the lab, what I used to do was I would find an excuse to check email. So, you know, that's always justifiable. Maybe there's an email from my supervisor, that's going to be important. I better check. And then while email's loading, you open another tab and you load a news website, because news is justifiable, right? That's not procrastinating. And then you open YouTube and, you know, 40 minutes later you're watching videos of cats. So, and then it would be lunchtime, and then, you know, the whole process would repeat. So I used email kind of as like this anesthetic. So there was some kind of problem that was stressful, and it was a way of just not thinking about it and avoiding the problem. So instead what I started doing was I would take a walk around the campus, and just to give myself a little bit of time to think of different options, stay calm, and then go back to the work. Also, I slowed down and took greater care over small details. So I did everything as carefully as I possibly could. So even though I was under a lot of time pressure, I only had a few months and no publications. By slowing down, things were far more likely to work. And so that led to experiments working, and that led to a couple of publications, which in turn meant that I thought, okay, maybe I can actually get a PhD if I can publish something. And it's not like everything suddenly worked brilliantly, but it just gave me that slightly higher success rate, which was enough to help me succeed. And the third thing was I stopped worrying about the end result. So partly because of my undergraduate performance, I was always a little bit worried that at some point I was going to be found out. You know, that either at the thesis defense, where they asked me some kind of question about undergraduate physics that I had forgotten or never learned in the first place. And I just decided, you know what, I don't care what the examiners think. You know, I've made it this far, I'm going to get my thesis in, and if they don't like it, you know, that's their problem. But I'm not going to fail because I didn't do my bit. You know, so just put my best effort into what I can control, and then, you know, they can think what they want of it. Okay, so this final point, it really relates to what I think of as true confidence. So a lot of people think of confidence as being kind of a knowledge or a certainty that you will succeed. You know, all you have to do is believe and you'll succeed. It's kind of positive thinking thing. But in research, you never have that certainty. You'll never know absolutely that you're going to succeed. You might do brilliant work and then you get scooped, you know, a month before you submit your thesis. You know, these things do happen. So in order to face whatever you're doing with confidence, instead of looking for certainty of success, instead I think it's better to accept the possibility of failure, but give it your best effort anyway, and trust in your ability to cope with whatever happens. So yeah, maybe you will fail your PhD, but you know, if you're intelligent and determined enough, you will find something else, you know, and it's not the worst thing that can happen. And that's where I think true confidence comes from. So those of you who are really paying attention will have noticed that I said there were 4 habits and I only put 3 up. That's because I'm saving the most important one for last. but it's also the one that people feel most resistance to, which is I turned off the internet. So, when I came to the point where I was starting to write my thesis full time, I knew I had this habit of turning to email whenever something went wrong. And because I would be sitting at my computer all the time, I wanted to make sure that I didn't have the option of procrastinating online. And I didn't want to rely on willpower alone, because that takes energy. So I got rid of my internet connection at home. So if I wanted to check email, then I had to cycle 10 minutes into university, or I had to go around to a friend's house, which was slightly inconvenient. But after the first week, I didn't miss it. And it meant that when I was sitting on my computer, the only thing that I could do was work on my thesis. And I ended up writing my thesis in just 3 months. And not only that, but I passed with 0 corrections. And I put a lot of that down to simply not having an internet connection. Now, it's not possible for everybody to get rid of the internet completely. So I now recommend a program called Freedom, where you can set a timer. I usually do it for 2 or 3 hours, where you simply can't get online on that computer. And it just gives you that space, that uninterrupted space, where if something difficult arises, you get used to just staying with the problem and thinking, rather than constantly being active and checking email, where you're being active but not really actually doing anything useful. Okay. So a lot of people feel resistance to this, but just to indicate how important it is, I just want to check how many people check email before getting out of bed in the morning. Okay, so it's a fair majority. So if it's the first thing you think of when you wake up, before even eating or any other natural instincts that you may have, then when you face a problem in your work, it's the first thing you'll think of then as well. So if you remove the option, it frees you up to spend that energy on actually doing something else. Okay, so those final few months, even though I was under the most time pressure, and even though I still had a huge amount to do, they were actually the most productive and the most enjoyable of my whole PhD. And I actually really enjoyed the final couple of months of doing experimental work and also writing up as well. So I think this shows what is possible. I don't think my talk is enough to guarantee that this is the secret that will guarantee it for everybody. But it shows that assumption at the beginning that stress is kind of this inevitable, necessary part of the process. I think that's completely wrong, and it is possible to enjoy it with the right kind of approach. So obviously, all of this is a massively simplified version. PhDs are way more complicated than this. There's loads of stuff we haven't even touched upon. So we'll get into the question and answer session. And basically, you can ask whatever you want. These are the kinds of things I talk about quite a bit, and I talk about in the book as well. So I'm going to stop talking, and it's over to you to decide what we talk about next. Okay, so first question. Yes?
When you submit your thesis and you prepare for your Bible, what is your tips about that stage?
Okay, so it's quite a difficult time when you submit your thesis, because you've been working on this thing for so long, and then suddenly it's gone. This thing which has taken up so much of your life, and it can kind of feel like I should be doing something. The thing is, though, that 99.9% of the result is determined by what you've already done up to that point. So if your work is outstanding, if you've got maybe, say, 3 publications in really good journals, then it's quite difficult, as long as you actually did the work and it's not plagiarized or falsified or anything, it's actually quite difficult to screw it up in the Viva. They know that you'll be nervous, and they will see that it's good work from the thesis, and it's kind of like a sort of rite of passage. It's not quite a formality, but most people in that situation will pass. The counterside to that is if your work is terrible, there's nothing you can do in the defense to make up for it. So to some extent, there's really not very much you can do in that space. It does depend a little bit though on what the format is of your defense. So if you have to give a presentation, obviously prepare that, and I think run through it with an audience at least twice, possibly even more than that. Make sure it fits in the time that you've got, that sort of thing. Read through your thesis, remind yourself of what you've said. It can be tempting to say, okay, so I know this area is a little bit weak in the theory of this, and so you spend a month reading up on that, and then maybe they don't ask you anything about it. So it's really hard to predict, what is going to be a good use of your time. So I think reading up on what your examiners are expert in is always a good idea. What are they known for? You should kind of have an idea of that before they're appointed. But it's always good to know. Okay, so this person's really strong in this area. This person's really strong in this. That's an important thing. But for the most part, there's not that much you can do. I think in the 2 days before the defense, try to think through every possible contingency. So what are you going to wear? Okay. So if you're going to wear a suit, make sure you've got everything. Make sure maybe take a spare shirt in case you spill coffee on one of them. You can take it to a further level of paranoia. Make sure you've got a sewing kit, so if you rip a hole in your trousers in the morning, you can fix it. Those kinds of things, it's partly a distraction, thinking through all the things that can go wrong and what can you do to counteract that. And it also gives you a little bit of a sense of control, by almost obsessing over these little details. I'd also say don't drink too much caffeine the day before or on the morning of the Viva, because you're going to be nervous anyway. And if you've had 6 cups of coffee the day before, you're not going to sleep. And then you get up and you're exhausted and really nervous, and that's just horrible. So avoid caffeine the day before, maybe 1 coffee on the morning of it. That's it. When you're about to go in, that's the worst time. So the 10 minutes before, and there is nothing else you can do. It can be even worse. In my case, they started 10 minutes late. So those 10 minutes we're running over. I'm thinking, what are they talking about? And you can really work yourself up. But when I went in, I found that as soon as I'd started answering the first question, the time just disappeared. I was in there for about 2.5 hours, and it felt like 20 minutes. And actually, even though I was really nervous going in, I quite enjoyed it. And the reason was that it was the one opportunity I had in 4 years to sit down with experts in the field and just talk about the research. One extra thing to bear in mind, they will ask you questions that you don't know the answer to. They might not know the answer either, but it's okay to say I don't know as long as you follow it up with something else. So they want to see how you think. So it's if you don't know something, say I don't know, but I would think that because of X, Y, and Z that this would be the case, and in order to find out, this is what we would have to do. And you might be wrong, and it might trigger some other discussion, but that's kind of the idea, is to find out, can you have a discussion on a peer-to-peer level with other academics. It's not really so much about, is this good work? It's just about how you think is what they're really assessing. Okay, next.
We have heard that usually the decision has been taken before the defense. Is this true or not? I mean, the examiner both, they already have agreed if, to pass the student or not.
Yeah.
Is it true or
generally speaking, they will have a good idea of what the result is going to be. Most of the time, again, the procedure varies from place to place, but most of the time they will fill in a pre-examination report where they give their assessment just based on the thesis without having seen you. And so if they write, this is excellent work, all of these really good things, obviously the chances are that you're going to pass. I think the only way that you won't is if it turns out that you've in some way lied.
Yeah.
You know, so if it's obvious that you didn't do the work, so if they ask you something fun, you know, really basic and you can't answer it, you know, that if that's the case, it's your own it's your own fault. But yeah, I think it is largely true that the decision is mostly made before you go in. As I said, you know, if it's great research, it's hard then to fail in the defence. And if it's terrible research, there's really not a lot you can do in the defence to counteract that. But your supervisor should be the first kind of gatekeeper, and they should be advising you, you know, okay, this isn't up to standard. We need to get an extension or whatever. I think that it's really important generally to discuss your work with loads of other people on a frequent basis. So you're constantly getting other people's opinions and criticisms and different ideas. If you don't get that feedback, then it's you know, you don't want the first time you discuss your research or get feedback on your research to be in the defence. So if you've done that regularly throughout your PhD, you know, you should hopefully be aware of any serious shortcomings, because people will question.
That is from place to place. I mean,
It does.
If you have people who are interested in your in your research area, and you can do like a monthly presentation for the group, or I think the other way is just to participate in the conferences or any meeting in your area, so at least you can enrich your knowledge and background.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add one other thing, is that it doesn't need to be on a formal basis. One of the really useful things for me was being surrounded by other researchers, so PhD students and postdocs and lecturers, and just hearing about what they were doing. So you can learn a lot from reading, but if you hear a conversation, you find out about things that you weren't looking for, you wouldn't have otherwise found. And that I think helps to give you this sort of breadth of knowledge as well. So if you're not in a situation where you have that regular contact, try to create it. I mean, you have, you know, this student group right here, you know, so, you know, if you don't get support from your supervisor, just get a few of you together and just discuss, you know, how's it going. Even if you're not from exactly the same field, I think it's a useful thing to do. Yeah. Next question? Yes?
Do you have any advice about working with the literature? Because, you know, when you talk about secondary references, I sometimes find that I go on the secondary reference and the secondary reference of that, and then I don't know where I've come from, and I just end up thinking that I haven't really done that much.
There will be a lot of dead ends in the literature, and sometimes you follow something, you follow a trail of references, and you find actually that wasn't that useful, and that's just part of the process. Not just with literature, but in research in general, there'll be all sorts of things that you investigate which don't necessarily result in something that you can actually use later. I think that a really important thing to do is to try to filter the literature that you find by some kind of category of importance. Because if you have like 10,000 papers, then if you read a rate of 10 per day, every day, it'll take you, you know, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 years to read them all just once, you know. And then there'll be other stuff published during that time, and you know, you cannot possibly read everything, and so you have to select where you're going to direct your attention and your time. And I didn't do this in quite such a formal way during my PhD, but one of the things that I now advise people to do is categorize things into 4 groups. So you have the A group. These are the things which are absolutely crucial to your research. So anything that your research relies upon. So if you use a methodology from somebody else's paper as the foundation for your own work, or if there's a basic assumption that you take from somebody else's paper. Those are really, really important. And you might read those several times throughout your PhD. So those are the kind of A grade ones. Also, the kind of superstar papers, so whoever invented the technique that you're using, it's always good to know what they did. If something's been cited 1,000 times, it's obviously really important to the field, and so you need to know what those people have done. Then you have ones which are sort of the B grade. So these are things which you think are probably pretty important. Maybe it's not absolutely crucial, but you think, okay, I really need to understand this because it's quite closely related. Then you have the C grades, which are, okay, this looks like decent research, but I'm not quite sure how it would be useful, but it kind of looks interesting. And then you have the D grades, which is just, this is irrelevant or it's just not very good. So a lot of research which is published is really, it's either not very important and a lot of the time it's wrong. One of the things you'll notice as you get more and more experience is you find things which have been published and you think, how on earth did that make it past peer review? So just because something's published doesn't mean it's necessarily good or worth your time. So you have these 4 categories, but they're not equally distributed. So the A grade ones, the most important, there may only be 5 or 10 of those in all of the literature. I could boil down the literature that I really relied on to a handful of papers, and I can still remember the names of the authors of some of them and which journals they were in. And I graduated in 2007. So that's how many times I referred back to those things. So you'll have a handful of those, and then you have a few more of the B grades, a few more of the C grades, and the D will be the majority. So those ones you just scan through quickly. You scan the abstracts and think, no, move on. So you have to treat those very, very quickly. It can be difficult to make the judgment, but the judgment can change. So you can have something in your C pile and you think, actually, this isn't as good as I thought it was, let's relegate it. Or something that you looked at and dismissed, when you refer back to the literature, you think, oh, actually, this could be useful. So you can go back to the literature all the time and find other things and reclassify them. But it's important to make that initial judgment, I think. Yes?
Related to that point is the question of relevancy, how
Yeah.
to judge relevant things. I think we need some tests on that. I mean, my way of doing it is, the easiest thing is to look at the authors. Usually the authors would stick with the same subject. With the thing. The judgment of quality would be based on the impact factor of the journal that's been done on it. The other things is just looking for creative things. And that's my way of doing it. Is there any better way?
I think you've touched upon some really good things, especially with the authors. And some of them are kind of like the superstar authors, and you need to know at least what those people have done. If everybody knows those people, you should know you should know who they are, why they're such a big deal. But there might be some people who are less well known, but they're doing something really, really close to what you're doing. They published something that's you think is really useful, and I think it's good to track what they're doing. Keep looking up. You can look at everything that they've published. So you can't read everything in the field as a whole, but you can read everything that one person has written, or you can be aware of what it is. And as a side point, when you come to being close to submitting your thesis, if you want to update your literature review, then look at the authors who are really important. See if they've published anything recently, or see if anybody else has cited them, because anyone else doing something similar to you is likely to cite those same things. Impact factor, it's not the most reliable, but if you see something that's published in some really obscure conference proceedings from 1968, I think, oh, the title looks kind of relevant, and then you can't find it, it's probably not worth the effort. Usually, it's not absolute, but usually it's not worth the effort of digging out. And you just have to sort of trust your instinct, and you get better at it with time. So in your first year, you might not be very good at judging whether something's good research or not. But as you get practical experience of doing your own research, you learn, how these things work. So in my first year, I didn't have that much experience with the equipment, and so I just thought everything that was published, that must be good. But then, in the third year, I was, reading these things and think that is terrible. That's obviously an image artifact that's somehow been, mistaken for something that's real. And you just get better at it over time, with experience. There's a question over here.
Yes, do you think it's a good idea for PhD students to choose an external supervisor or just leave it to supervisor?
You mean the external examiner?
Examiner.
Yeah. I think it should be a discussion between the two of you, with you and your supervisor. Your supervisor might suggest somebody, and then you look up who they are, and you think, oh no, I really don't want that person. Or you think that they have a particular expertise, and that's not where I want to be examined. And maybe there's someone that you really want. So in my case, my supervisor suggested somebody, and I went with his judgment because I trusted him. I had a really good relationship with my supervisor, and it worked out quite well. So yeah, I think if you just discuss it both ways. So maybe they suggest something, check out who they are, and don't be afraid to voice your opinion. Okay, there's a question there.
Related to academic writing, did you face any challenge in this area? Even you are a native speaker, because by that the difference between the normal writing and the academic writing.
Yeah.
Usually we are not native speakers.
Yeah.
So if you face that, what is the solution?
Okay.
That can overcome this.
Yeah. So in my case, I've always had a bit of an urge to write. So when I write back when I was in primary school, they'd get us to write little stories, and I'd write these 20-page things, which at the time was considered like this epic. Everyone else was writing 2 or 3 pages, and I was actually getting into narrative structure and all this. And also, I've always had this instinct. Even if I'm writing a text message, I want it to be grammatically right. I hate text speak. I'll never abbreviate something, and I will find another way to phrase it. And that sort of slightly perfectionist instinct, it's really good training, because you have this constraint of a fixed number of characters, and then you've got to, the first way you think of phrasing it doesn't fit, so you have to restructure it, and usually you can find a way. So I'm kind of lucky in that respect that I have some, I guess, innate instinct which has been trained to some extent, but I've worked with a lot of people who are in that situation of writing in a second language, maybe less confident in writing as well. So I think that specifically for people writing in a second language, one of the things that happens is when you reach a certain level of proficiency in your spoken language, there are certain structures that you use quite a lot, which work really, really well and are very adaptable to different situations. Native speakers have this as well, but it's especially true, I think, of people in the second language. There was one that I read recently, and a German speaker, and she was always writing further to this, further to this, further to this, further to this. And grammatically it's fine, but it becomes this really noticeable thing, and it's really distracting. So I told her, just cut out all of them. And often the sentence still works. So partly it's getting someone, either reading through and looking for those patterns yourself, or getting someone else to read it and point out what your habitual structures are. And then once you're aware of it, then you can start to look for alternatives. One exercise that I get people to do is, again, looking at this principle of starting small. Just focus on one idea. So forget writing a chapter or a paper or an entire thesis. Just one concept. So this could be a definition or some abstract idea, or it could be a statement that says the purpose of this research is, and just write it. Make an attempt, and then rather than moving on to the next thing, edit it immediately. So you can usually tidy it up, because when the first attempt at writing, it comes out like you speak. So when people speak, there's lots of ums and ahs and stops and starts. So you can usually tidy it up, fairly easily. But then, rather than trying to polish that sentence any further, at the end, just write "in other words," and then think of a completely different way of expressing the same idea. And what it forces you to do is play with the language, and come up with alternative solutions. So as I said, if you just go with the first option that comes to mind, you never think of anything creative, and you deny yourself the opportunity to find alternatives. So if you just look for another way of saying it, maybe you won't use it, but often it's better, and it just forces you to break out of those habitual patterns. I can talk all evening about writing, but in answer to that specific thing, that would be what I would advise. If you're really worried about writing in English, get English tuition. And don't wait until you have to write your thesis and there's all of that pressure. Start now, and get someone who can critique your writing, not just a proofreader, but someone who can teach you alternative grammatical structures and that sort of thing. Because if you know it's going to be a problem, then do what you can. Like I said with the preparation for the defence, do what you can to mitigate that problem as early as possible. Next question? Yes.
Making publications. Tim, as a specialized in law, so I'm doing law, and making publications tend actually to take time.
Yeah.
To the extent that it might delay your or my viva.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to balance either to try to have some publications before the viva is just coming, or just make it afterwards. So
yeah.
I'm finding it a bit difficult to balance these two.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Is it what to prioritize? I mean, in other words, publishing some stuff, would it facilitate, the viva itself?
Yeah. I think it's always a good idea. If you have something of a publishable standard, it's always a good idea to put it out there. Going back to my definition of a PhD, you want to demonstrate that you have the skills of a professional academic researcher. That is how professional academics are assessed on do you have publications, or how many publications are you producing, what impact factor journals are you publishing, and that kind of thing. So if you arrive at your viva and you have, say, 2 publications which are related to chapters in your thesis, and they've been accepted, they've passed through peer review, it's very difficult for an examiner to then say, well, this is no good. If you've then published it in Journal of British Law or wherever it is. So it's you've kind of already passed if you've done that. Obviously, there is this bit of a trade-off. Publication does take time. The peer review process can take months or years sometimes. So you have to make decisions as to, maybe you have enough for 3 publications. If you're just going to publish one, which is going to be the easiest to publish. So you might pick a journal which has a faster turnaround time, maybe has a shorter format, and then you can say, you can put at the beginning, this paper in preparation, for submission to this place. So you indicate to the examiners that this is going to be published. So if you can get one as a minimum, I would say, you know, if it takes a little bit longer, then at least make sure it's submitted and in review by the time of the Viva. 2 is fantastic, 3, perfect. But you've got to balance it with, you know, whether there are other pressures. Do you need to graduate by a particular time for work or financial reasons or visa reasons or whatever? Go for at least 1 or 2 if you have time, I think. Next question? Yes?
The last few months
Mm.
have been writing pressure. What
Yeah.
would you recommend apart
Okay.
from turning up your intellect?
Yeah. Well, that would be the first thing. So, if you're in the last few months, then I think it's kind of helpful to think in terms of where you need to get to. So, this is time, and this is your submission date. On the day that you submit, whatever you hand over, you can no longer make any changes. It's just printed, and then that's done. You know, that's what it will judge. So if this axis is, I guess, uncertainty about what your thesis is going to be, right? So on submission day, that has to be 0. It's fixed, no more changes. If we go backwards in time, so like 2 days before, you only have time to make a few minor corrections, you know, putting in references, adding maybe a couple of paragraphs, but basically most of it is fixed, you know, then it needs to be in a submissible state. And if we track this back over time, you know, there needs to be this trend where, you know, it's gradually decreasing. So the further away you are from submission, the more possible variations there are on your thesis. So, you know, for any kind of scientists or engineers, you know, you can think of it in terms of entropy, so it's in a low state. So, what happens as you do research is things get more and more complicated. You develop more options. So you start off with a simple question, and then it gets more complicated over time. So you have this upward trend where you're adding more and more different things. You're creating more possibilities. So there has to be a point where you stop adding new things, and you start consolidating what you have into a finalized form, so it stops changing. Now this distance, or this amount of time, the closer that is to your submission date, the more stressful it's going to be. So if you're, say, a week away from submission, and you have 6 chapters, and they're all, say, 70% complete, and you're trying to finish them all at the same time, and you're still doing some data analysis, you know, it's going to be incredibly stressful. Whereas, you know, if you're in a state here, or, you know, like a couple of weeks before, and you've got 6 chapters which are done, absolutely submissible, and you just have, you know, your conclusions to write, not so bad. You can handle that. So it's a roundabout way of getting to the point. But first thing you have to do is stop pursuing new ideas. Okay, so there are always extra questions that you can add in, and at some point you have to say, enough. I'm just going to write up what I have, and then what you need to do is go through chapter by chapter and finish each one, get them into a submissible state. So if you start with the introduction, okay, and just work on that and get it looking like a complete thesis introduction. So there's no gaps left for later. There's nothing where you say insert reference here. You know, all the formatting is done, everything. Okay, there might be some things that you could change, but it's basically submissible. Then you're one step closer. And then you do the next chapter, and the next, and the next, and the next. So the closer you get to submission and the more the pressure builds up, the more you feel, actually, I've got loads of this done and in a submissible state. So this kind of differs from most of the standard writing advice. A lot of people say just write a first draft really fast, don't worry about the details, and then, you know, go through the whole thing again and again. You go through several drafts. But I think that often results in a huge amount of stress, because you produce all of this writing and nothing ever gets finished. So I think work on just one chapter at a time, get it into a complete submissible state, and then move on to the next one, and that that is generally less stressful. It also means that you've got a single point of focus at any one time, rather than working on one specific thing, rather than working on lots of different things. Another thing I would say is that your writing pace will vary over time, depending on the difficulty of the ideas that you're talking about. So some ideas you'll be able to write really fast. The things you know really well that you've spoken about millions of times. You can just churn that out. But then there will be other ideas which are more difficult. So that just sometimes you have something which is kind of this half-formed idea in your head, and you don't quite know what the right words are to express it, and you just have to, it really takes a lot of effort to get the words down on the page. Now, if you focus on must be productive all the time, must produce more word count, then what happens when you hit those problems? A lot of people say if you hit writer's block, just move on, write something else, just write really fast. But that problem remains unsolved. And so eventually you run out of easy things to say and you've got all the difficult stuff at the end. So what I say is when you hit a block, slow down, let yourself slow down, give yourself some time to think, consider different options, different ways of phrasing it. Does this idea actually belong here? Do I even need to include it? What are the implications of it? Just think, calmly sort of think it through, and you give yourself the opportunity to solve those difficult problems of expression. So often when I write, it usually takes me, 30 or 40 minutes before I really get going, but I'm cut off from the internet, so I have to, just gently sort of stay attached to it, and then I speed up and get a bit of momentum, and then I hit a block. And I'm quite happy sitting there for 10 minutes, just thinking about what is it I really want to say? How does this fit into the argument? How is this going to lead into the next thing? And it's kind of calm focus that I'm able to find, and a lot of people find that quite difficult because of the pressure to always be writing. That's why I think it's especially important to be cut off from the internet when you do that. So that that's kind of, it's quite a long answer, but it's really as brief as I can be on this subject. As I said, I can talk about it all night. But that I think is the kind of most important ideas. Any more? Yes.
My question is kind of mix of everything.
Okay.
But it's more about being more. I just want to ask, if you have a good relationship with your supervisor from the beginning,
yeah,
and then this relationship will start to disturb, and you have the impression from that you can't trust the supervisor, for example, and you have been told by the supervisor that it's better not to get PhD and transfer to MPhil, something like that.
Yeah.
So, do you believe in yourself and complete fighting and go that alone, or do you think that the supervisor know more than you?
Okay.
This is the first part.
Okay. Can I answer the first part and then because it's a big question.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's hard to give a definitive answer because there have certainly been cases that I've come across where people should quit, where people should walk away, and they're so attached to the idea of having a PhD, but they've been working on it for 5, 6, 7 years sometimes, and they're still not making progress or still not making a decision about what their project actually is, and but they can't let go of this, I guess, romantic idea of being a doctor and having a PhD. and certainly having worked with a lot of academics, some students, should walk away. However, there are also instances where, the supervisor really doesn't take responsibility for their students, and they just say, okay, go off, do your thing, and then all they do is criticize. No, that's not good enough, etc. Which I think is kind of neglect, and I think it's quite immoral to do that, because students invest so much in getting a PhD. So I think what you have to do is get an independent opinion. Speak to other academics. Like, is this a good idea that I have? Is this project worth pursuing? And find people who are honest, and perhaps not as attached to it. And think about it. If you are going to continue, maybe you have to change supervisor or change university. Which is a difficult thing to do, but sometimes it's the right thing. I've certainly worked with people where that's the right case. Or if you do leave, what else could you do? If you're at that stage where your supervisor's saying that, you have to consider that as a possibility. I'm not saying absolutely give up, but it's being realistic and looking at the situation as it is and saying, okay, I have a contingency plan, so I'm going to try this, but if it doesn't work out, I have other options. It's not the worst thing that can happen. So unfortunately, it's not a very definitive answer, and it is a very difficult situation to be in. But yeah, I would say first of all, speak to other people and get different opinions, and have contingency plans, and give yourself other options. What was the second part of the question?
The second part, if you have uncompleted project, so for example, if you started a project and you haven't finished it, and then you transfer to another completely different project, and they were different supervisors, or one of them he already retired and leave the university, and the other one the supervisor couldn't find a link between the previous project and the new project. But there is a hope that you will publish the first part of the project. But it's very, very not 100% sure that you can publish something from the first work.
Yeah.
But it needs a lot of work or some more experiment to accept it. So, if your supervisor told you not to do anything to the previous project, which could give you a chance to publish something and help you to be strong in a strong position at the final in the Viva and in the end of your project or PhD. So do you listen to the supervisor and not to do any further work to the first project, or do you just ignore and complain, not listening? And
I think again you have to look at each case on its own merit. Research always takes different directions, and sometimes you have to let go of perfectly good ideas simply because you don't have the time or the resources to complete them. Sometimes resources, it means expertise that you have access to. So if your supervisor isn't interested in a particular area, if they don't really want you to go in that direction, then that is a consideration.
She's not interested in that part, but she wanted to be in the thesis.
Okay.
Thesis.
Right.
So.
Okay. So if she wanted to be in the thesis, then do whatever's necessary to develop it to a worthwhile state. I think the key though is whatever direction your research takes at this point is looking at the skills that you've developed from the first project and how you can apply those to whatever it is you do with the new supervisor. My project did actually change quite a bit throughout the course of my PhD. And in the very, very final stages, I took on a little side project, which I was able to implement very quickly because I had experience with using that equipment and I got some interesting results, and I could follow it up and develop it into a publication very fast from nothing, just because of the practical experience that I had built up. And I also had to let go of some things simply because there wasn't time to complete them. So it was a case of, well, if this is going to go into my thesis, okay, I'm not going to achieve everything that I originally planned, but if I just do these bits, that's still worthwhile, and it's still a good kind of contribution. So I think you have to look at, you know, what is possible and practical, and maybe not necessarily, you know, don't do anything on the old project, but kind of compromise and do less on it, and then more on this other thing as well. I'm afraid, with supervisory issues, it's the hardest thing for me to answer because it's so dependent on the personalities involved and the individual cases. So I can't give a definitive answer saying, no, leave that project behind, because I don't know anything about the project. So I think talk to different people and see what they say, and consider different options and combinations of things that you can that you can do. Okay. Any more? We'll take yes. Sir.
The thing is, it's really worrying me how to keep motivation during 3 or 4 years.
Okay. It's quite a common question. I think it's inevitable that your motivation will go through peaks and troughs. You might have long periods where it seems like nothing's really working. Also, you know, if you're constantly reading about the same things again and again and again, it can get a little bit boring. And that just happens in whatever work that you do. I think an important thing is giving yourself an interesting but achievable level of challenge to focus on. So maybe you don't feel motivated about a PhD as a whole, but you can isolate one particular problem, which you can focus all of your effort in. It's like, okay, this bit I'm going to do really, really well. And you can take this attitude towards the most mundane tasks, and it actually makes them quite interesting. If you're painting a wall and you say, right, I'm going to do the best job on this, right? And it's not quite the same as when I said, you know, with the literature review, the best literature review in the world. But it's, you know, focusing on little details that you can actually achieve, and then you can take pride in the quality of the work that you're doing. I find this especially with writing, taking the time and just getting it, just right is really, really satisfying. But also even putting the references in and making sure that is in the format that I want it to. And that in itself could be an afternoon's work, but you stay with it, and then when you achieve it and you get it right, you feel this little sense of pride. So I think doing small things as well as you can is a really good way to stay motivated. Put all of your energy into those little things, and it also results in better work usually. We'll take one more. Yes.
What do you think will help when it comes to linking like chapters together, ideas together, and paragraphs together? That's like a good base of work.
Yeah. Okay.
Everyone stands alone, good in its own, but not with the flow and with everything.
Okay. To some extent, my thesis was a bit like that as well, because as I said, I changed direction a little bit. So my 3 experimental chapters, they're pretty different. And so the way I linked it was in the introduction, I went really quite broad. So I justified, first of all, why nanotechnology was important economically and socially, and then if we want to achieve these things with nanotechnology, we need better understanding of materials. These are particular interesting properties. In order to understand those, we need these experimental techniques. So it's kind of funneling down, till you get to a point where it's broad enough to encapsulate all of the things that you do, but specific enough to be leading in a definite direction. And then what I did was each individual chapter had its own introduction and mini literature review. So if you have a single literature review which sort of jumps from one subject to another, it can be a little bit confusing. So what I did was I kind of had general principles and general sort of trends in research, and then each chapter had its own introduction outlining the specific problem. One of the examiner's comments was that it's a little bit disjointed, but they didn't really care that much because of the quality of the work was high enough. So actually I demonstrated professional level of proficiency in quite a range of techniques, which was a pretty good thing. So the internal examiner said that there isn't a continuous thread that runs through it, but he said it's a good thesis and absolutely deserves a PhD, and it passed with 0 corrections. So they must have really liked it. Do the best you can. Don't worry too much. If all of the chapters are good work, then the examiners they should be okay with that, and they understand that no PhD project follows this perfect path. It should be okay.
Another question
Yeah.
is because my view is the same kind of idea for experimental, and I have a general literature in front of it. Did you bring it back at the discussion about altogether again, or no?
Yeah, a little bit. In the conclusions, I kind of broadened it out again. Without overly labouring the point. I think a conclusion, shouldn't be too long, really, because they've already read however many hundreds of pages of your thesis. They get the point. So yeah, I think it's good. It's good to relate it back to those general themes. So say how this contributes to that, the general direction that the research is pushing in. You don't have to overwork it, I think. Often it's having the confidence to stop talking, which is what I'm going to do. So I think that's a good point to end on. I'm afraid I have to keep plugging the book. I do have some copies to sell. £18, which is cheaper than you can get them on Amazon, and if you buy 2, then it's £30. And I do take cards as well. So thank you very much for listening. Thanks for asking so many great questions. If anybody has any questions that they think of afterwards, I should have put my email address up there, but it's jameshaytonphd@gmail.com. So feel free to email me and ask anything. So thank you very much.
Excuse me, guys. The Saudi student, Abu Yazid. Excuse me, guys. The Saudi Student Club Elise would like to sincerely thank James for being with us today. Thanks for dedicating part of your valuable time, answering questions, and you're such an informative talk. So would like just to provide you with this. Please accept this humble gift. So. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.